During dinner, my in-laws demanded our daughter hand over her paid Paris tickets to her cousin. "She deserves it," she smirked. Then my husband stood up and said this: "You should call the airline tomorrow morning and transfer the Paris tickets to Stella. You are older, Hazel. It is time you act like an adult and look at the bigger picture." That was the exact sentence. Cold, sharp, slicing right through the smell of roasted garlic and red wine at our dining table like a butcher's blade. My mother-in-law, Agatha, did not ask. She did not suggest. She demanded. She said it with the casual authority of a queen ordering a servant to hand over their boots in the mud. The clinking of silverware against porcelain stopped dead. The entire room seemed to freeze. I watched my daughter, Hazel. She is 18 years old, a girl who has spent the last year working until her hands were raw, and right then, her fork froze in midair. A piece of chicken hung on the prongs, forgotten. I watched her eyes drop immediately to her plate. Her shoulders curled inward. It was a physical reflex, a deeply ingrained habit of making herself small whenever her grandmother entered the room. It broke my heart into 1,000 jagged little pieces, but the worst part was that I knew where she learned that reflex. She learned it from her father. She learned it from me. Beside Hazel, my husband, Julian, turned his head slowly. He is 45 years old, a grown man with a graying beard and a solid career, but sitting next to his mother, he always somehow looked like a frightened 5-year-old boy. He looked at Agatha as if he was not entirely sure he had heard her correctly. He blinked, the gears in his head grinding against decades of programmed submission. At the head of the table sat my father-in-law, Victor. He simply nodded along with his wife, picking up his wine glass and taking a slow sip. He looked like a puppet agreeing with the puppet master, totally unbothered by the absolute absurdity of what had just been said. My name is Nora. I am 42 years old, and for 18 long, agonizing years, I have sat at dinner tables just like this one. I have watched this family treat my beautiful, hard-working daughter as if she were an extra in a movie, a polite inconvenience, someone who only existed to serve as a stepping stone for the rest of them. I have swallowed insults. I have softened the blows. I have bitten my tongue so hard and so often that it is a miracle I can still speak. I always told myself that I was keeping the peace. I told myself it was just how they were and that family was complicated. But tonight, as I looked at Agatha's smug, satisfied smirk, something inside my chest physically cracked. It did not snap loudly. It was a soft, slow sound, like thick ice breaking under steady, unrelenting pressure. I felt my heartbeat echoing in my teeth. My hands, resting on my lap under the heavy linen tablecloth, balled into fists so tight my fingernails dug into my palms. The air in the room felt too thin to breathe. I was completely done. To understand the absolute insanity of Agatha demanding those plane tickets, you have to understand the sick, twisted economy of my husband's family. In Agatha and Victor's world, love is not something you give freely to your children or grandchildren. Love is a currency. It is a tool for manipulation. It is something you earn by being compliant, and it is something they withdraw the second you step out of line. And in this toxic little economy, there is a clear winner and a clear loser. The winner is Stella. Stella is Hazel's cousin, the daughter of Julian's older brother, Roland. Stella is also 18, just a few months younger than Hazel, but they might as well be different species. Stella is the classic golden child. She glides through life on a cloud of excuses and stolen achievements. She has never held a job. She complains that folding her own laundry gives her anxiety. Her parents, Roland and his ex-wife, treat her like she is made of spun glass, and my in-laws worship the ground she walks on. If Stella gets AC on a test, Agatha praises her for trying so hard under immense pressure. If Stella wants a new designer handbag, Victor suddenly finds the money because she needs to feel confident. They constantly talk about how overwhelmed Stella is by the world. Overwhelmed by what? Breathing? Waking up before noon? Then there is my Hazel. Hazel is the scapegoat. Hazel is the workhorse. Because Hazel is capable, independent, and quiet, my in-laws decided very early on that she did not need support, praise, or even basic respect. Agatha's philosophy was always that Hazel was strong, so Hazel could handle disappointment. It was a sick way of justifying their blatant favoritism. Julian, my husband, grew up in the exact same dynamic. Roland was the golden child. Julian was the punching bag. Julian was raised to believe that obedience was the ultimate form of love. He was conditioned, like a circus animal, to understand that any conflict with his parents was an act of profound disrespect. He was taught that parental authority was the final truth of the universe, and his only job was to smooth things over. For our entire marriage, Julian chose the illusion of peace over protecting his own family. He never meant to be cruel to Hazel or me, but his silence was its own kind of violence. Whenever Agatha made a snide comment about my cooking, Julian would look away. Whenever Victor forgot Hazel's birthday but bought Stella a pony, Julian would tell me to let it go because his dad was getting old. I hated him for it sometimes. I hated myself for staying silent alongside him. We were teaching our daughter that her feelings did not matter, that she was second best, and that she should just accept the crumbs thrown at her. That is the history sitting right here at this dining table. That is the poison that led to this moment. The entitlement Agatha displayed tonight did not happen overnight. It was built brick by brick, year after year, milestone after milestone. If you want to know how deep this sickness goes, you just have to look back at Hazel's 10th birthday. It is a day that still haunts my nightmares, a day I realized just how damaged my husband was. Hazel had wanted a bicycle. Not just any bicycle, but a bright cherry red cruiser with a little woven basket on the front. We saved up for it, and the morning of her birthday, she came down the stairs, saw it in the living room, and cried actual tears of joy. She loved it so much she didn't even want to ride it outside right away. She just sat on it in the hallway, ringing the little silver bell. That afternoon, Agatha, Victor, Roland, and Stella came over for cake. Stella was also 10 at the time. The second Stella walked in and saw the red bicycle, her face crumpled. She did not have a new bicycle. Therefore, the universe was fundamentally unfair. She threw a massive, screaming tantrum right there on my living room rug. She kicked the coffee table. She wailed that she hated her life. Instead of disciplining her, Agatha scooped Stella up, glaring at me as if I had personally slapped the child. Then, Agatha looked at Julian. She told him that Stella was going through a hard time because her parents were arguing lately. She told Julian that Hazel already had so many toys, and it would be a beautiful gesture of family unity if Hazel let Stella take the bicycle home. Just to borrow, of course. Just to make her feel better. I remember stepping forward, my blood boiling, ready to throw them all out of my house. But Julian put his hand on my arm. His face was pale, his eyes pleading with me. He knelt down in front of our 10-year-old daughter. He used his gentle, soft father voice, the voice he used to comfort her after a nightmare. He told Hazel that being a big girl meant sharing, even when it hurt. He asked her to be the bigger person. Hazel looked at her dad, her hero, and she nodded. She got off her shiny new bike, handed the handlebars to a suddenly smiling Stella, and walked upstairs to her room. We never saw that bicycle again. Stella left it out in the rain a month later, and it rusted. Julian bought Hazel a cheaper, used blue bike a few weeks later, but the damage was done. I sat in my bedroom that night and cried, paralyzed by my own guilt. I was the peacemaker. I let my husband break our daughter's heart to appease his mother. By the time the girls were in their sophomore year of high school, the dynamic had escalated from stealing toys to sabotaging futures. Hazel has always been a brilliant student, but she struggled with advanced calculus. She wanted to be an engineer, and she needed a high grade. Julian and I agreed to pay $400 a month for a private math tutor. It was tight on our budget, but it was an investment in our kids' future. Hazel was thrilled. Her grades skyrocketed. Then came the annual family summer barbecue. Agatha cornered Julian by the grill. She informed him that Stella wanted to go to an elite, out-of-state cheerleading camp. The cost was $2,000. Roland could not afford it, and Victor refused to pay the whole thing. Agatha's solution? Julian needed to chip in $1,000. When Julian told her we didn't have that kind of extra cash because we were paying for the math tutor, Agatha laughed. A literal, mocking laugh. I was standing by the cooler, listening to every word. She told Julian that Hazel was smart enough to figure out math on her own, or she could just use free internet videos. She said, and I quote, that Stella's self-esteem was fragile, and cheerleading was her only identity. If Stella didn't go to this camp, she would be ruined, whereas Hazel would be fine no matter what. Agatha told Julian he was being selfish by prioritizing a math grade over his niece's mental health. Victor chimed in, patting Julian's shoulder, telling him that family resources go to the one who needs the boost. It was insane. It was financial manipulation dressed up as family loyalty. I walked over, grabbed Julian's arm, and told Agatha absolutely not. We were not canceling our daughter's education for a cheer camp. Agatha did not speak to Julian for 3 months. She ignored his calls. She acted like he was dead. The silent treatment nearly destroyed him. He lost weight. He couldn't sleep. The childhood programming was so strong that the withdrawal of his mother's approval felt like oxygen leaving the room. But for the first time, he didn't cave. We kept the tutor. It was the very first tiny crack in Julian's armor, the first time he realized the price of his mother's love was the sacrifice of his own child. Thank you for watching the story. If you relate to what's happening, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment helps the video reach more viewers. Thank you very much. That brings us to the Paris trip. Going to Paris after high school graduation was not just a passing fancy for Hazel. It was a dream she had nurtured since she was 10 years old, probably right around the time she learned she had to rely on herself to get the things she wanted. She had a poster of the Eiffel Tower above her bed. She learned French on a free app. And when she turned 17, she sat us down with a spreadsheet and told us she was going to fund the trip entirely on her own. And my God, she did. While Stella was spending her weekends sleeping until noon and complaining about the Wi-Fi speed, Hazel went to war for her dream. She took on 3 part-time jobs. 3. During the week, she worked the closing shift at a local diner. I would wash her uniform, and it always smelled faintly of old coffee, stale French fries, and bleach. On Saturday mornings, she woke up at 6 to scrub floors and clean bathrooms for a residential cleaning service. Her knees were constantly bruised from kneeling on tiles. On Sunday afternoons, she tutored middle school kids in math. She was exhausted. There were nights she would come home at 11, drop her backpack in the hallway, and just sit on the floor, too tired to make it up the stairs. But she never complained. Not once. In her bedroom, sitting right on her desk, was a large, thick glass jar. She had taped a piece of paper to it that simply said Paris in black marker. Every Sunday night, she would sit on her bed, empty her pockets, and smooth out the crinkled dollar bills she got from tips. She would fold the larger bills she got from cleaning and drop them into the jar. I watched that jar fill up over 12 months. I watched it go from loose change to a solid block of green paper. She saved every single penny. $3,500. Enough for the flight, a modest hostel, and food. It was not just money in that jar. It was her blood, her sweat, her missing weekends, her absolute sheer willpower. It was physical proof of her dignity. While Hazel was out there grinding, a quiet revolution was happening inside Julian. You see, an abusive dynamic thrives in the dark. It thrives when everyone agrees to pretend it isn't happening. But watching his daughter kill herself to achieve a dream dragged everything into the harsh, blinding light of reality. Julian started waiting up for her. On the nights she worked late at the diner, he would park his car across the street, just watching the entrance to make sure she walked out to her car safely. I went with him a few times. We would sit in the dark, watching our tired little girl wipe down tables through the diner window. One night, sitting in that car, Julian broke down. He rested his forehead against the steering wheel and cried quietly. He told me he was watching his daughter build the exact boundaries, the exact independence that he never had the courage to build for himself. He realized that Hazel was working 3 jobs not just to go to Paris, but to ensure that nobody in his family could ever take the trip away from her. She was buying her freedom from their control. He realized the behavioral cycle he had perpetuated. By forcing Hazel to share with Stella, by telling her to be the bigger person all those years ago, he was grooming his daughter to accept mistreatment from the world. He was teaching her that she had to set herself on fire to keep others warm. Seeing her fight for her dream, seeing the dark circles under her eyes, woke up a primal, protective instinct in him. Something shifted in his core. The scared little boy desperate for his mother's approval finally started to die, and a father protecting his cubs started to take his place. Agatha and Victor did not know about the shift. They thought Julian was still their loyal, programmable puppet. So tonight, at this dinner, they thought they could just pull the same strings they always pulled. They thought they could just reach out and steal the jar. They had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them. So there we were, sitting at the dining table, the air thick and heavy with the audacity of Agatha's demand. Transfer the tickets to Stella. Hand over the money. Act like an adult. Hazel was still looking down at her plate, her shoulders hunched. It was as if she was trying to fold herself into a tiny, invisible square so the emotional shrapnel would not hit her. I felt a hot, blinding surge of adrenaline rush through my veins. The kind of anger that makes your vision narrow and your ears ring. I was about to open my mouth, ready to flip the heavy wooden table over and scream until my vocal cord snapped, but before I could, Victor cleared his throat. Victor leaned back in his chair, swirling his red wine with a relaxed, philosophical expression on his face. He looked at Hazel and spoke in that condescending, slow tone he always used, as if he were explaining a very simple concept to a very slow toddler. He told Hazel that family is about sacrifice. He said that Stella had been dealing with a lot of emotional distress lately, that she was struggling to find her path, and that a trip to Europe was exactly the kind of cultural reset she needed to find herself. He actually used those words. A cultural reset. Then he looked at Julian and smiled, a tight, thin-lipped smile that was more of a threat than a friendly gesture. He told Julian that it was our job as the stable household to support the weaker links in the family tree. He said Hazel had her whole life to travel, but Stella needed this victory right now to cure her depression. I sat there, listening to this masterclass in emotional manipulation. They were not asking Hazel to be kind. They were demanding that she pay a $3,500 tax for the crime of being responsible. They wanted to punish her for her hard work and reward Stella for her complete lack of effort. It was a sick, twisted redistribution of achievement. They wanted Hazel to bleed so Stella could take a vacation. I looked at Julian. I expected him to look down. I expected him to mumble something about talking it over later, the classic avoidance tactic he had used for 18 years. I braced myself for the disappointment, preparing to fight this battle completely alone. But Julian did not look down. Slowly, deliberately, Julian placed his napkin on the table. He pushed his chair back. The wooden leg scraped against the hardwood floor, a harsh, loud sound that cut through the silence like a gunshot. And then, he stood up. He did not just stand up, he seemed to grow. For our entire marriage, Julian had always carried himself with a slight slouch around his parents, a physical manifestation of his emotional submission. But right now, his back was straight. His shoulders were squared. He looked down at his mother, and his face was entirely devoid of warmth. It was a face I had only seen once before, years ago, when a stranger at a park had yelled at a toddler-aged Hazel. It was the face of a protector. No, Julian said. It was just one word. It was not shouted. It was not screamed. It was spoken with a low, vibrating intensity, a quiet, dangerous calm that sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Agatha blinked. Her smug smirk faltered, replaced by a look of genuine confusion. In 45 years, her son had never simply told her no. He had negotiated, he had pleaded, he had avoided, but he had never offered a flat, undeniable refusal. She stared at him as if he had just started speaking in tongues. "Excuse me?" Agatha asked, her voice shrill, offended that her script had been interrupted. She let out a short, forced laugh, trying to regain control of the narrative. She told Julian not to be dramatic, that they were simply having a family discussion about logistics. "We are not having a discussion," Julian replied, his voice dropping an octave lower. "You are not taking my daughter's money. You are not taking her tickets. And you are never going to speak to her like that in my house ever again." The psychological terror on Agatha's face was fascinating to watch. You have to understand how a narcissist operates. Their entire sense of self is built on the absolute compliance of their victims. Julian was her primary source of control, her most reliable puppet. And right in front of her eyes, the puppet had just picked up a pair of scissors and cut its own strings. Victor was not going to take this sitting down. He slammed his hand flat against the table, the silverware rattling against the plates. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He stood up to meet Julian's gaze, trying to use his height and his booming patriarch voice to intimidate his son back into submission. Victor pointed a thick, shaking finger at Julian. He told him that he was raising a selfish, ungrateful brat. He yelled that Hazel needed to learn that the world did not revolve around her little goals, and that when the family elders made a decision for the greater good, she was expected to fall in line. He actually used the phrase family elders. It was grotesque. I watched Hazel physically flinch at her grandfather's yelling. But then I watched Julian step closer to the table, completely placing his body between Hazel and his father. He became a human shield. "The greater good?" Julian asked, and this time there was a bitter, mocking edge to his voice. "You mean Stella's comfort? You want my daughter, who worked until midnight scrubbing floors for a year, to hand over her wages to a girl who refuses to wake up before noon? Hard work does not make you special in this family, does it, Dad? Only obedience makes you special." Agatha gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. She cried out that Julian was being cruel, that Stella was fragile and suffering. "Stella is lazy," Julian stated, flatly and cleanly. "And you have enabled her laziness her entire life. But you are not going to use Hazel as a stepping stone anymore. Hazel paid for every single dime of that trip herself. It is her money. It is her name on the ticket. You have absolutely zero jurisdiction over her life." Agatha leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into two venomous slits. The mask of the loving grandmother completely slipped off, revealing the ugly, controlling tyrant underneath. She hissed at Julian, telling him that she had plenty of jurisdiction. She reminded him that she and Victor were family, and that they had ways of making things very, very difficult for us if we chose to be stubborn. She was bluffing, trying to rely on old threats. But she did not know that Julian and I had spent the last month quietly, methodically dismantling every single piece of leverage they had over us. "You think you have leverage, Mom?" Julian asked, his voice chillingly calm. "You think you still hold the cards?" He reached inside the breast pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, white, legal-sized envelope. He did not throw it. He placed it down on the dining table right next to the roast chicken, tapping it once with his index finger. The heavy thud of the paper against the wood felt like a judge's gavel coming down. Victor and Agatha stared at the envelope. Confusion quickly curdled into apprehension. Let me give you the backstory. 15 years ago, when Hazel was just 3 years old, Julian had a major health scare. He had to have an emergency surgery, and I was a wreck. During that chaotic time, Agatha relentlessly bullied and guilt-tripped us into signing a document granting her and Victor secondary emergency guardianship and medical power of attorney over Hazel. Agatha claimed it was just for safety, in case something happened to both of us. But over the years, she weaponized it. She would casually drop it into conversations, reminding us that she had legal rights to our child, subtly implying that if we crossed her, she could drag us into court for custody. It was a psychological leash she kept tied around our necks. "Open it," Julian commanded. Agatha's hands were actually trembling as she reached for the envelope. She tore the top open and pulled out the thick stack of papers inside. The first page had a giant, blue, embossed notary stamp right at the bottom. I watched her eyes dart back and forth across the legal jargon. It took her brain a few seconds to process the heavy, formal language. When she finally realized what she was reading, the blood completely drained from her face. She looked like a ghost. What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely working. "That," Julian said, crossing his arms over his chest, "is a finalized, legally binding revocation of your secondary guardianship. It also strips both of you of any medical, educational, or emergency decision-making power regarding Hazel. The state no longer recognizes you as having any authority over my daughter. You are completely, permanently cut off from her legal existence." Victor snatched the papers out of his wife's hands, scanning them frantically. He barked a bitter, nervous laugh. He told Julian he could not just cut them out of the family with a piece of paper. He yelled that family bonds were stronger than ink. "You cut yourselves out," Julian replied coldly. "I am just making it official." But we were not done. Taking away their legal illusion of control was only half the battle. We still had to neutralize their ultimate weapon, the money. For 10 years, Victor and Agatha had been contributing to a 529 college savings plan for Hazel. They loved to brag about it to their friends. They loved to present themselves as the generous, wealthy grandparents securing their granddaughter's future. But behind closed doors, that college fund was a hostage. Every time we had a disagreement, Agatha would threaten to stop the contributions. If we did not attend a Sunday dinner because Hazel was sick, Agatha would sigh and say it was a shame we did not value family, and maybe she should rethink putting money into the college account. If Hazel did not want to hug Victor, Victor would remind her that his money was going to pay for her textbooks. They used that money to demand obedience, affection, and compliance. They held Hazel's college education over our heads like a swinging blade. I had been sitting silently the entire time, letting Julian lead the charge. But now it was my turn. I reached into my purse, which was resting by my feet, and pulled out a second white envelope. I slid it across the smooth surface of the dining table until it hit Victor's wine glass with a soft clink. Agatha's mouth twitched. She looked from Julian to me, genuine fear now swimming in her eyes. "Another one?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Oh yes," I said, my voice smooth and steady. I felt a profound, terrifying sense of peace wash over me. The peacemaker was dead. "This one is from me." Victor ripped the envelope open with clumsy, angry fingers. He pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. It was a financial statement from the bank. Let me explain the beauty of the law. Victor and Agatha had deposited the money, yes. But because they wanted Julian to manage the investments, Julian was listed as the legal account owner. They were merely contributors. Under the law, the account owner has the absolute right to withdraw, move, or reallocate the funds. Victor read the statement. He read the total balance. $0.00. "You," Victor stammered, his eyes bulging out of his head. "You froze the account? You stole our money." "I didn't freeze it, Victor," I said, smiling a very thin, very final smile. "And I certainly didn't steal it. I simply relocated it." I explained to them, slowly and clearly, so there could be no misunderstanding. I told them that Julian had legally withdrawn every single penny from the 529 plan last Tuesday. We had taken the entire sum, which was roughly $40,000, and we had placed it into an irrevocable trust. The trust, Julian added, stepping in to deliver the final blow, is established solely under Hazel's name. It cannot be altered, it cannot be cancelled, and most importantly, it cannot be accessed by anyone except Hazel when she turns 18. Not me. Not Nora. And definitely not you. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of complete, utter defeat. Agatha and Victor realized, in that exact second, that they were bankrupt. Not financially, but emotionally. They had lost their puppet. They had lost their legal threats. And they had permanently lost their financial leverage. The money they had used to terrorize and control us was now safely locked away in a vault that they did not have the key to, and it was going to benefit the exact person they had spent the evening trying to humiliate. It was a checkmate. A flawless, brutal checkmate. Agatha let out a bizarre, high-pitched wail. She slammed her hands on the table, knocking over her water glass. The ice cubes scattered across the wood. She screamed that we were monsters, that we had manipulated them, that we were tearing the family apart over a stupid vacation. The hypocrisy was so thick you could choke on it. While Agatha was throwing a literal tantrum, screaming about disrespect and betrayal, something incredible happened. Hazel, my quiet, resilient, exhausted daughter, finally moved. She did not cry. She did not yell. She simply placed both of her hands flat on the table, pushed her chair back, and stood up. The scraping sound of her chair cut right through Agatha's screaming, silencing the older woman out of sheer shock. For 18 years, Hazel had made herself small in the presence of these people. But tonight, standing under the warm glow of the dining room chandelier, she looked 10 feet tall. She looked at her grandfather first. She did not break eye contact. "You never actually ask what I want," Hazel said. Her voice was trembling slightly, but her chin was lifted high. "You just tell me what Stella needs. You tell me what I have to give up so she doesn't have to feel bad about doing nothing. But I am not her placeholder. I am not your sacrifice." Victor opened his mouth to argue, but Hazel held up her hand. It was a gesture of such absolute authority that Victor actually snapped his mouth shut. Then, Hazel turned her gaze to her grandmother. Agatha was breathing heavily, her face blotchy and red. "I am going to Paris," Hazel said softly, but the words carried the weight of a judge reading a final sentence. "I paid for my tickets. I earned my money. And I am not giving up my dignity just so Stella can feel special for 1 week." Agatha gasped, clutching her pearls like a cartoon character. "How dare you speak to your grandmother that way? We are your family." "No," Hazel replied, her voice steady and unbroken. "You are just people I happen to be related to. And you do not get to hurt me anymore." She paused, letting the silence ring out before delivering the final, crushing blow. "I want you to leave my house. Now. And I do not want you to ever come back." It was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. It was the healing of generational trauma, happening right in front of my eyes. My daughter had just broken a cycle of abuse that had plagued my husband's family for decades. Victor's face twisted into an ugly sneer. He pointed a finger at Julian. "This isn't over," he threatened. "You are going to regret this. We will get the rest of the family involved. You will be completely isolated." "Goodbye, Dad," Julian said, pointing toward the front hallway. Agatha and Victor snatched their coats from the entryway bench. They were muttering curses, swearing vengeance, promising that we would be the ones begging for forgiveness. Victor aggressively grabbed the brass handle of the front door and yanked it open, ready to storm out into the night and begin his smear campaign. But as the door swung open, Victor and Agatha froze dead in their tracks. Standing on our front porch, under the dim yellow porch light, with evening rain dusting the shoulders of his jacket, was Roland. Stella's father. Julian's older brother. The supposed golden child of the previous generation. Roland did not look happy. His jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. His eyes flicked from his shocked parents, to Julian, to me, and finally settled on Hazel. Agatha immediately tried to play the victim. Her face shifted instantly from rage to manufactured sorrow. "Oh, Roland, thank goodness you are here," she cried out, reaching for his arm. "Julian and Nora have gone completely insane. They stole our money, they are brainwashing Hazel, and they are refusing to help poor Stella. You have to talk some sense into them." Roland looked down at his mother's hand on his arm, and then, with a look of utter disgust, he physically shook her off. He stepped past them, entering our hallway without being invited. "Stop," Roland said. His voice was cold, tired, and devoid of any affection. "Just stop lying, Mom." The room went dead silent once again. Roland turned to Julian and let out a long, exhausted sigh. "Stella called me 20 minutes ago," Roland explained. "She was having a meltdown. She said Grandma had promised to bring her Hazel's Paris tickets tonight, and she was crying because she had already started packing and the tickets weren't there yet." Roland shook his head, running a hand over his face. He looked at his parents, and for the first time, the golden child looked at them with complete clarity. "I knew you spoiled her, Mom. I knew I spoiled her too. But demanding that Hazel hand over a trip she worked 3 jobs for? Trying to steal a teenager's earned vacation to cover up Stella's laziness? That is sick. Even for you, that is sick. Victor puffed out his chest. We were making a family decision, Roland. We were trying to help your daughter. My daughter needs reality, not a stolen vacation, Roland snapped, his voice echoing in the hallway. And you two need a severe reality check. Roland turned away from his parents and looked directly at Hazel. His expression softened. Hazel, he said, I am so sorry. I am sorry they did this, and I am sorry Stella went along with it. You go to Paris. You go, and you have the time of your life. You earned every single minute of it. Then, Roland looked back at his parents. Get in your car and go home, he commanded them. Do not call me tonight. Do not call Stella tonight. Without waiting for a response, Roland gave Julian a brief, solemn nod, turned around, and walked back out into the rain. Victor and Agatha were left standing there, completely humiliated. Their golden son had just publicly defended the scapegoat and condemned their behavior. They had no allies left. They had no leverage. They had no power. Agatha opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. She looked small, old, and incredibly pathetic. Julian stepped forward, grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden door, and looked his parents in the eyes one last time. Do not ever contact us again, Julian said. And then, he shut the door. It closed with a heavy, solid thud. He locked the deadbolt. The click of the metal sliding into place was the greatest sound I had ever heard. The house was incredibly quiet. There was no tension. There was no fear. For the first time in 18 years, our home felt safe. Julian turned around, walked over to Hazel, and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a tight, secure hug. I joined them, burying my face in my daughter's shoulder, letting the tears of absolute relief finally fall. We were free. After 18 years of conditioned compliance, my husband finally nuked his relationship with his toxic parents to protect our daughter's hard-earned dream, legally and financially cutting them off for good. My in-laws are now playing the victims and begging other extended family members to intervene and force us to apologize. So, I have to ask, am I the jerk for refusing to ever let them see my daughter again? Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button and ring the bell to support the channel and never miss a story.